It has been called the passport to the future in education.
Yet right now, it's also the focus of some of the fiercest political battles happening across the country. I'm Andrew Rafferty.
And I'm Libby Casey. This is Election 22, What Matters, a collaboration between the Washington Post and Newsy.
The students that we serve, they are the future.
Alarm bells are ringing. Inside America's classrooms, test scores are falling. Nationwide, a critical shortage of teachers.
A lot of the creativity that teachers used to be able to embed in their lessons has been pulled away.
The battle over what to teach is now front and center on the campaign trail.
If I could have a conservative majority on every school board in the country, we would be in such good shape.
We feel like there could be so much more done, and they're not looking at the correct things. They're worried about things that aren't really bothering the parents right now.
This is episode 2 of a Washington Post Newsy special series, Election 22, What Matters? Now, from the Washington Post newsroom, Libby Casey and Andrew Rafferty.
There has always been a political debate about education, frankly, from the very founding of our country. But today there are a whole new set of flashpoints impacting everything from local school board races to gubernatorial contests.
The pandemic made challenging issues worse, like test scores and achievement gaps. And conversations about how our nation's history is taught have turned into shouting matches across the country, as the role of teachers in educating students about social issues is under new scrutiny.
All of it playing out amid disruptions in in-person learning, and that has had a major effect, especially on fourth graders. Math and reading scores of 9-year-olds plummeted by the largest margin in more than 30 years. Today, more than half of Americans say they are dissatisfied with the quality of education in K-12 schools. Though that's actually not new, the deep partisan divisions in education are. And we begin with the battles that are driving that divide. It's about far more than simply catching kids up. Instead, school board members and governors are focusing on issues like critical race theory and transgender students in sports. Katie LaGrone begins our reporting from Florida.
From a pandemic to politics, mask mandates to the so-called Don't Say Gay bill, this school year in Florida has seen some fiery battles already. And amid those battles, books are fueling some of the biggest.
Distribute sexually explicit material. This is not about not teaching history.
I'm so tired of begging because I'm seeing this filth.
In data we obtained from dozens of districts across the state, Florida schools received approximately 300 formal library book challenges in the past school year alone. Most accuse the books in question of being too sexually explicit for students. One complaint stated a book addressing LGBTQ issues found in a 5th grade classroom promoted, quote, religious-level social justice propaganda. Another said the book aimed to, quote, ultimately push homosexuality. Dale Galliano made the complaints to the St. Lucie County School District in January. In fact, she submitted every one of the 17 challenges to that district last year, despite not having any children of her own in school.
I don't think that an 8-year-old needs to know about sodomy, rape, incest.
Who are you and why do you care?
I'm a widow. Why I care is because these kids are my future. And it's the future of this country.
So you've challenged books that you have not read.
I've read impartial.
Conservative group Moms for Liberty and conservative nonprofit Florida Citizens Alliance have also emerged as prolific and vocal challengers. And the ones we spoke with don't plan on backing down.
We believe that we're waking up parents and giving them some tools to get a better education for their children.
Other parents and students alike have a different opinion.
It's a cartoon. It's harmless. I disagree that it's a form of indoctrination or there's an agenda behind it. These are just normal people just like you and me.
Even math textbooks are accused of division. It all started with a press release in April from Florida's Department of Education accusing some textbook publishers of trying to, quote, indoctrinate Florida students by including critical race theory and other prohibited topics into math textbooks. 3 weeks later, the agency moved 19 of those books from the naughty list to the state's approved list after publishers revised what state education leaders framed as woke content. The state never confirmed exactly what content it deemed problematic. The process itself is secretive. After requesting the list of reviewers who evaluated these textbooks, Florida's Department of Education sent us a list containing the first and last names of more than 135 people. It lists as K-12 mathematic reviewers, though we found some of these reviewers don't even have a math background.
I was really surprised when I found that out.
Carrie Denote has 2 master's degrees in math, is a K-5 math instruction coach, and president of Florida's Council of Teachers of Mathematics. So it's no surprise she was a recent reviewer. She says she evaluated 2 math textbooks, one for kindergarten, the other 4th grade.
I didn't see anything that was inappropriate or questionable as far as a math textbook goes.
Also among Florida's math reviewers, civics and history teachers.
I can't see a reason other than, they're looking for something specific. And I would just ask why they picked that particular person.
Florida mom Chris Allen reviewed 2 math textbooks as a, quote, guest reviewer. She says she found glaring issues, most of them surrounding the inclusion of critical race theory, or CRT. The branding is problematic, as some critics use it to slam even teaching about slavery.
Saying that racism is embedded in American history is considered critical race theory.
According to all reviewer evaluations recently released by Florida's Department of Education, Allen was the only one to find critical race theory in the 2 textbooks she critiqued. It's issues like these that have transformed Florida school board meetings into epicenters of anger. And school board elections this year were just as contentious. Dozens of candidates, backed by Governor Ron DeSantis and Moms for Liberty, won their elections.
We have so many people that are just frustrated and want to reset and focus on education, and that's what we're going to get.
DeSantis and his allies are vowing to keep up the fight.
There are some places where some candidates won on a premise that they were going to essentially shut down some aspects of what we do in education, and that they want to interfere with that sacred bond that exists between parents and teachers.
And an interesting backdrop to all of this, while Governor DeSantis continues to tout his decision to return students back to in-person learning quickly during the pandemic, Florida students, much like students across the country, are still struggling academically. Testing shows language and reading scores are down among 3rd graders. And results are in from a new statewide civics literacy test. Of students that took this test for the first time last year, just 37% passed. Andrew?
Investigative correspondent Katie LaGrone reporting from Tampa. Katie, stay close. We're going to bring you right back here for a roundtable discussion in just a few moments.
Debates like these may be popular politically, but are they actually helping our kids? Our first guest is a high school history teacher with 25 years experience in the classroom. Kurt Russell was named the 2022 National Teacher of the Year. Welcome. Do your students call you Mr. Russell?
Thank you so much. And yes, that's totally fine.
Okay, Mr. Russell. Yes, thank you for being with us. So we know that students are struggling after the early months of the pandemic, and we know that schools are struggling with a teacher shortage. So what is the reality right now inside classrooms like yours?
Well, thank you so much for that question. And once again, thank you so much for having me. In my classroom, we are learning, we are growing, we are having tough conversations. And it's because kids are involved, and that engagement is happening each and every day in my classroom, because I give my students an opportunity to share their voice and to elevate their voices. And I think that's key in order for us to make sure that we progress educationally with all of our students.
You're in Ohio. There was a bill introduced in your state this year that would ban certain ways for you to teach about American history, including slavery. We're talking about things like the 1619 Project and diversity outcomes. Those are included. I understand that you teach an elective unit on oppression, which includes lessons on the Black Lives Matter movement. So how will that bill's passage impact you?
Well, I think when I started teaching, I made a promise to myself and to my students. And that promise was to make sure I give them the best educational opportunities I could afford them. And as a history teacher, the only way in which I could do so is by giving them the actual information. I do not sugarcoat what I teach, but what I try to do is to give them a framework in order for my kids to use and for them to formulate their own discussions and their own opinions.
Is that controversial?
For some, but not for my students. My students don't see it as controversial. My students see it as engagement. My students see it as reality. My students see it as an opportunity for us as a community of learners to grow together.
Well, we've been talking already about the dissatisfaction that some parents have with their children's K-12 education. But Mr. Russell, a Merrimack College teacher survey shows that teachers' job satisfaction is now at an all-time low, and only 12% say they are very satisfied. That's a drop from 39% just a decade ago. Can you give us some insight into why?
Yes, I think the main reason is that a lot of times teachers are not considered experts in the classroom. When there are policies being made, teachers are not necessarily at the table. And I think that takes away from our thrill, it takes away from our engagement within education. By teachers not being a part of making policies, it really shows the lack of respect that teachers have.
Well, Mr. Russell, you have a platform as National Teacher of the Year. So what is the most important message you want people to hear right now?
The most important thing as a teacher, I would like to make sure that students see themselves in the classroom to diversify the curriculum and also to diversify faculty and staff. And if we can do that, I believe we can grow as a profession.
All right. Thank you so much, Kurt Russell. We appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, Andrew, there is nothing like hearing from someone who is in the classroom day after day, living it.
Yeah, and what Mr. Russell seemed to be saying is you got to kind of put those political debates outside the classroom. All you can do is focus on educating the students that are coming to school every day.
And I imagine that is not an easy thing to do in this climate. Well, a quick break, and then we expand the conversation with our What Matters Roundtable. Katie LaGrone will rejoin us from Tampa. Washington Post education reporter Moriah Balingit is here, and Brian Lopez of the Texas Tribune will be in San Antonio. That's all next on Election 22, What Matters. When the governor of Virginia took office this past January, he did so after winning a divisive campaign, stoking controversies about how kids are taught. In fact, his very first executive orders included a prohibition on teaching concepts like critical race theory. His second, to investigate Loudoun County public schools, which had been embroiled in controversies over critical race theory and transgender rights, as well as what the Washington Post called bungled handling of 2 sexual assaults. And an order asserting parental rights in masking students. The fact that Youngkin's very first order banned the teaching of critical race theory misrepresented the facts. Critical race theory is not taught to students in Virginia schools. And as Katie LaGrone reported just a few moments ago, the concept has morphed into a catch-all for teaching about slavery. Let's get to our roundtable with reporters across the country. Katie LaGrone is back with us from Florida. From the Texas Tribune, Brian Lopez. And from the Washington Post, Moriah Balingit. And Newsy's political director, Andrew Rafferty, is with us, too. Katie, let's pick up where you left off earlier. Florida's Governor Ron DeSantis is growing his national profile by focusing on divisive issues like what's taught in Florida schools. The issue is popular in conservative media. A Newsy analysis shows more mentions of critical race theory on Fox News since January than CNN and MSNBC combined. So, Katie, is critical race theory taught in Florida's K-12 schools?
Well, it really depends on who you ask. Of course, teachers, school administrators, union leaders will tell you no. Some parents and the governor don't agree, which is why the governor has pushed for these new laws expanding parents' rights, which of course limits what can be discussed in the classroom and how certain instruction can be taught, including issues on racism and slavery and critical race theory. If teachers are found violating these laws, parents now here in Florida have a pathway to sue teachers and administrators in school. We've seen math textbooks, of course, get scrubbed over issues including prohibited topics like critical race theory and LGBTQ issues. And It's interesting to note while the governor has restricted certain topics from being discussed in Florida classrooms and how certain instruction is taught, here in Florida, we now also have a Victims of Communism Day, November 7th. It's a day the governor says is meant to basically honor people who have fallen to communist regimes. In fact, here in Florida, high school students now are required, mandated to have at least 45 minutes of instruction on communist regimes as part of all of this.
Well, Brian, let's go to you in Texas. Your state is in a battle right now over a social studies curriculum. A review slated for this year is now postponed until 2025. And among the issues, whether the curriculum improperly downplays American exceptionalism. So what's happening there?
Yeah, like you said, the board took the decision to delay that process. It usually happens every decade, and the point of it is to keep updating curriculum so students are learning up-to-date information. And what happened here is, that critical race theory kind of boogeyman has made its way up to our state board of education. We saw it in local school boards across our state, where principals were getting fired, superintendents were resigning, and it's made its way up to the state board. In the last meeting, that week of August 30th, they were flooded with hundreds and thousands of emails claiming that this curriculum had too many CRT concepts. It didn't hone in too much on what America was built on, and it focused too much on the bad of America. And that, for some members, that pressured them to vote no, especially when, a lot of these social conservative policies are, being big drivers in elections right now.
Well, let's go to Moriah, who covers national education issues for the Washington Post. So, Moriah, you and Brian have both been writing about crisis issues like teacher shortages. So let's talk about that. You're reporting that states are desperate. How bad is it?
We don't have a good national picture about how teacher shortages look. We know that a lot of places are reporting that it's worse than it's ever been. It actually was a crisis that started for some schools long before the pandemic. It's been going on for a decade, but certainly it's an issue that's getting a lot more attention now. I talked to the superintendent of Tulsa Public Schools in Oklahoma, who is now teaching a first grade class 2 days a week while overseeing a district of 33,000 people. I also know that some students are now in front of computers learning remotely or learning on programs because teachers simply can't be found. Or occasionally, sometimes I've heard of schools actually beaming in teachers from other cities because they can't get teachers to move to their communities. So this is an ongoing issue. Certainly the pandemic exacerbated things. And one thing, too, I think that's important to note is some of the shortage numbers are actually new positions that were created because of the relief fund. So that is kind of a good thing. Schools got all this money to address problems of students falling behind, but they haven't been able to hire for those positions, so it comes up as a shortage.
And Moriah, what is at the heart of why it's hard to fill these positions? I mean, we talked earlier to the National Teacher of the Year, who talked about issues like respect and pay. What is your reporting showing is driving it?
So it's multifaceted. A lot of it has to do with pay in some places. In some places, people simply can't afford to be teachers anymore. But it also has to do with respect, like you said. There's a high level of dissatisfaction and burnout in the teaching community. In many places, I think they feel like they're overly scrutinized and not respected. So that is also certainly playing a role. And then in some cases, it's just people don't want to be teachers anymore, I think, because of that perception that it's a profession that's not respected and because it's become a very, very difficult job, particularly during the pandemic.
Well, Andrew, let's turn back to parents. Parents are vocal. Overall, they're not happy with what's happening in schools right now. Is there an overlap in what Democratic voters and Republican voters are unhappy about?
Yeah, well, Libby, it's interesting. We got some recent numbers out from Gallup, and you can look at the partisan breakdown of how individuals feel about education. And you see, it wasn't that long ago where Republicans and Democrats were pretty much on the same boat in terms of satisfaction, but that did change over the course of the past 2 years. And now you see that gap, 51% of Democrats versus 30% of Republicans. And so what's driving that? Well, there is a sort of overlap in that both parties are concerned about curriculum, what overall is being said, but that partisan divide we've seen over recent years is driven by, for Republicans, much more of them feel like there's a political agenda being driven in classrooms. Democrats are much more concerned about resources, like we've been talking about, teacher shortages, funding, making sure kids have the resources they need. That's why we're seeing this divide really grow.
Well, Katie, politically in Florida, the politicians who focused on these more divisive cultural issues, are they seeing success? Are voters electing them?
Well, it's too early to tell that at this point. We did see some Republican lawmakers have some success during the primaries last month, but we're really not going to understand fully where all this sort of cultural rhetoric divide stands with the general public until November. And it's interesting to note here in Florida, for the first time, the number of registered Republicans actually outnumber Democrats. Now, what that translates to at the polls in November is what we're all sort of waiting to see. And it's also interesting to note that these culturally divisive issues, critical race theory, don't say gay, this is all new since the 2020 election. So that November general election coming up is really going to be the barometer to how the public feels about all of this stuff.
All right. Well, thanks so much to Katie LaGrone in Hillsborough County, Florida, Brian Lopez in San Antonio, Texas, and Moriah Balingit here in Washington. A quick break, then we're back with a look at some specific races we're watching in the weeks ahead. Back now in our closing moments, as we focus on how debates around education are affecting the midterm election. Andrew, give us a sense of some of the individual races you were watching.
Yeah, tough to narrow it down to just three, but we'll highlight it just because education is playing out in so many of these races across the country. We'll start with one we heard a lot about today, and that's Florida. Governor Ron DeSantis taking on Democrat Charlie Crist. And DeSantis has really made education part of his national brand, not only in this race where he's up for re-election, but also potentially looking to 2024. Has had his thumbprint. That's right. I don't want to talk about it too early, but it's a part of it. He has put his thumbprint on a number of school board races, endorsing about 30 of them. Most of those candidates have won. Early, worth noting, Charlie Crist has chosen his running mate, the head of the largest teachers union in the state. And so that's one we're going to have our eye on and see if education and Crist is able to make any sort of headway there. Another one, a governor's race up in Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer versus Tudor Dixon. Dixon got through a very crowded Republican primary with the support of a name that might sound familiar to a lot of our viewers, Betsy DeVos, Trump's education secretary, proponent of school choice and charter schools. Tudor Dixon has made education, specifically parental rights, wants to put curriculums online, protect, in her words, women's sports. She has 4 daughters. Whitmer, looking pretty good in the polls, has tried to stay out of that cultural battle, but with so much outside money going into it, she might have to face that head on a little bit more. Then in Arizona, and there are a number of races like this, superintendent of what's called public instruction, Kathy Hoffman versus Republican Thomas Horn. And this is one that has gotten pretty nasty. We've heard a lot of the terms about like indoctrination that Democrats under the incumbent Kathy Hoffman have been exposing school children to sexualized ideas that wouldn't necessarily be appropriate for those types of school children. They had a debate just the other day where Thomas Horn really focused on discipline in the classroom. There's about 5 other races like this for head of schools going on in conservative states where similar themes are coming on. And as I mentioned, there's a ton of outside spending focused on education, which we haven't seen really in the past.
Well, thanks so much to Andrew and to all of our guests this half hour. Next week, join us as we discuss how the politics of abortion are shaping the midterm election. I'm Libby Casey.
And I'm Andrew Rafferty. Thank you for watching Election 22, What Matters, a collaboration between the Washington Post and Newsy. We'll see you next week.